try to do is give you an overview of what the book is about. We don't have a lot of time. It took me 2 years to write it. I have 20, 30 minutes of your attention tops. So I'll try to compress it. I also try to make it tangible. You will see that the book, and in part myself, take a very broad perspective. I operate at a very high level of abstraction at times, but the things I'm discussing as Christina was illustrating them, I think have repercussions on individual professions and on our daily lives. And so I'll try to connect what I talk about to things that are hopefully useful to you. There is a book underlying this whole thing, and it exists. Christina was mentioning you should see some copies going around. This is a recent book. It came out just before the summer, and since then, that's actually how we met the first time. I was kicking off my first book presentation, and I've been on a bit of a tour since then. Now, I've realized when presenting this book that maybe the easiest way to give you a sense of what it is about is to tell you just a few words on its genesis, which is that it all started, or it is very much a product of the early phase of the pandemic, not only because there was less, let's say, moving around and social life, and therefore more time to read and write, but also because, if you recall, at the time, there was, a new virus, no vaccination, no treatment, and so effectively governments put in place lockdown orders, stay-at-home orders, so we were stuck at home, and everything was sort of going bad. So the public health situation was bad. Intensive care units were flooded, and the economy was bad in the sense that obviously consumption was tanking, the economy was tanking, and for those that were looking for a silver lining, perhaps the only silver lining, or the main one, that got picked up on newspapers as under the headline of "Nature is Healing," was to be conducive to the fact that a set of indicators related to the environment started to improve. So the quality of the air started to improve, the quality of water started to improve, CO2 emissions started to drop. At some point, you even had these pictures going around on social media with dolphins being spotted in the canals of Venice. Now, later on, these pictures proved to be fabricated, so there were no dolphins in the canals of Venice, but it sort of stuck with me, and it was the spark of the reflection on the relationship between the economy and nature. And so even once COVID is long gone, even once stay-at-home orders, lockdown measures are no longer a thing, could it be that curtailing the size of the economy should be part of the policy toolkit, let's say, given that we do need to reconcile ourselves with nature, improve these environmental indicators, reduce these CO2 emissions. And that's a bit how this whole reflection started. I don't know if I have no. It started as a reflection on the economy and nature, loosely speaking. You rapidly get into reflecting on economic growth and the link between economic growth and nature, broadly defined. And as soon as you start doing these things, you have to add an extra layer, which is the way the system is organized, again, using broad terms, or a capitalistic setting. And this generates a sort of triangle, or holy trinity, unholy trinity, depending on how you see these things. And what the book is about, in one slide, is the interconnections between the elements of this triangle, which is to say, what is the relationship between the economy and nature? Can we have a greener economy, a greener growth that is compatible with nature or not? What is the relationship between capitalism and growth? Can we have, as some claim, a steady state capitalism, or are the two sort of closely related? What is the link between capitalism and nature? So some claim, again, the critics would say, it is the actual system that is flawed and bound to destroy nature, and so it's impossible to green capitalism. and that's a bit where the friction starts. Just one chart to say, when I often present these things, to a certain extent to the private sector, to some private sector actors, a lot to economists, people often tell me, we know that economic growth is important, or that growth is important, so why did you even waste 2 years of your life to write a book about that? And in a way, my impression is that actually there's a growing cohort of people that not necessarily see it this way, or not necessarily see why growth should be important or why we shouldn't get rid of it. And I think that this is the product of a multiplicity of things. And by the way, this is particularly true in younger generations, let's say, so mine, millennials and Gen Zs. And I think that this is the sum of a multiplicity of factors. The first being that we haven't really seen that much growth, and that's a bit what the chart on the left tries to show. It shows the cumulative growth that people in various generations in US history have experienced, and you see that millennials are on the bottom side of the chart, which means they have seen the least cumulative growth in the early stage of their professional career. Another way of looking at this, so going beyond, let's say, raw, dry economics charts, if I look at my own experience, I graduated undergrad during the Lehman Brothers great financial crisis, so there was that recession. Then I was in Europe, so there was the Eurozone recession. After that, there was secular stagnation, so basically the economy was not really growing that much. Then we have the COVID recession. Then we have the energy crisis and possibly a recession coming up. So it feels like growth is always this elusive concept that is behind the corner, but the corner never turns. And so it remains very abstract in the minds of many. Of course, on top of that, you have the fact that, as documented by Thomas Piketty, but many others, where there has been growth, the limited growth that has been partnered with growing inequalities. And what this means is that the extra income that is generated at the country level is going disproportionately to the top 1%, top 0.1%, larger corporations. You can slice and dice this thing in multiple ways. But again, it sort of reinforces this idea of, if it remains an abstract concept, when we've seen it, it hasn't benefited the most, but rather the few. And on top of that, you partner it with something that I would believe is close to your heart, which is that there is a greater and greater environmental awareness. And of course, historically, industrialization and the beginning of fast growth has come to the detriment of nature, or rather has been partnered with soaring CO2 emissions and climate change. You sum all of these things together, and it shouldn't be surprising that many people are questioning the very concept of economic growth. The Economist was already mentioning some of this in a cover a few years ago, speaking of the rise of millennial socialism in the United States. For those of you that are most, how should I put it, into these type of discussions, and if you're not, you can switch off your brain for 10 seconds. This relates to the so-called donut economics approach. And what this model says in a nutshell, and I'm not going to do justice to Kate Raworth, which is the author of this famous book from a few years ago that is becoming very popular in Europe as an approach. What she says is, we need to safeguard nature. What I called nature, she identifies as the planetary boundaries or the external part of a donut. We need to get the stuff we care about, whether it is housing, whether it is access to water, whether it is education or whatnot. So there are certain things that matter in life. There is nature on the outside, and so what you want to make sure is that you're operating within the limits of the donut or inside inside this donut, where you're achieving the good stuff and you're not doing so to the detriment of the planet, let's say. The first part of the book, going back to my holy and holy trinity, looks at this relationship here. And the first conclusion I try to draw up front in the book is to say there are, given current consumer preferences, and I stress this part because we're going to see it's important, and I'm going to say one thing about it in a second. But given current consumer preferences, there are reasons to believe that capitalism, given the forces, given the way it is organized, tends to rekindle growth. And so that in a way, the system and the concept of economic growth are tightly intertwined, which doesn't mean anything up until point. If not, or my preliminary conclusion is to say, careful in just advocating how we need to get rid of economic growth. Because what this means is that you have to come up with an alternative view of how the system, the whole of society should be organized. And my impression is that often, especially natural scientists, with which I engage a lot, of course, on climate and environmental issues, would give up a list would give a list of things that are needed, more investment in renewables, more circular economy and whatnot, and then they say, and by the way, we also need to get rid of economic growth. Well, this is sort of belonging to a different ballpark, because what you're telling me is we have to restructure the whole way of how our economy is organized, which is fine, but then you need to give me an exact definition of what you have in mind with how you would organize society differently. Now, while I was writing this book, I've tried, and you've hinted at this, I've tried to, us economists get accused of being extremely narrow-minded, extremely stuck with our models, we don't read other things, we don't read other literatures, and I've tried to avoid that fallacy. Maybe also because I had more time, as I said, locked down in my Brussels apartment, but what I tried to do is go far and wide. And so I tried to draw from anthropology, evolutionary biology, social psychology, everything I found that could link to some of these aspects. And there is a lot that has been written on these things, even philosophy. Philosophers for centuries or millennia have been discussing on some aspects of whether materiality, material goods matter, or you should devote more time to non-material goods, friendship, family, and whatnot. All of these discussions, you find them in Plato, for example. So it goes just as far. So there is a lot of material that you can draw from, and I tried to do that. And even within economics, I tried to go beyond the mainstream, and so draw from literatures that are usually considered heterodox or outside of the mainstream. And indeed, I found some people that sort of agreed with my preliminary statement, which is to say they would agree that capitalism and growth are tightly intertwined. What they would say is we need to get rid of growth, therefore we need to get rid of capitalism, and because in this view people's preferences, which is what I was telling you, so the desire for more or for better and so on, is a product of the system, so it is the system that is pushing you to want more, whether it is through advertisement, whether it is through, I don't know, planned obsolescence or whatnot, they would argue you get rid of the system, and at that point people will be happy with whatever they already have, and so this desire for more would be gone, and at that point you can focus on nature, and we would have less, but so there would be scarcity, but this would be voluntary scarcity, would be embraced along the lines of what I was telling you, so less material goods, more, I don't know, culture, literature, reflections, I don't know, something like that. And this allows us to reconcile ourselves with nature. There would be better sharing, the argument goes. So you would have less, but you would share more, and it would be happily done, let's say, or voluntarily done. The policy conclusions of this type of reading or of this type of literature are multifold. You would drop economic growth, as I was telling you, and consumerism. You would do that to an extent. Of course, the planet is wide and big, and there's a lot of people and different nations in different conditions. This type of literature says this is something that rich countries should do, whereas, of course, poorer countries still need growth to provide for the poorest. And then you would continue innovation, but you would do that in a centralized manner. So rather than letting corporations or the private sector do this, you would centralize it and do it through a government, let's say. In a way, this type of literature looks at the experience of eco-villages, which are, I don't know how much familiar you are, these are places, they exist. They are places that are scattered around Europe and beyond, in Latin America, in Asia. and North America as well. And these are smaller communities, 50 to 100 people, who've sort of retrenched from a capitalistic system, devote time to agriculture, basic trades, and the idea of this type of literature is say we should scale it up to, I mean, national level or ideally global level. And you produce locally, of course, and you administer decision making through direct democracy or decision by consensus. Now, my book, after reviewing carefully this type of literature, comes to light to some different conclusions. And the first conclusion that I would disagree with is that chances are, or the argument I make is, if you are in a steady state environment, so if you are in an environment where resources are capped and where you no longer experience any growth, this does not bode well, this does not pave the way for greater sharing. We have had moments in the history of mankind, of humankind, where the economy was effectively stagnant or growing extremely slowly, and these are periods. Imagine a feudal type of society. These are periods that not necessarily bode well for sharing at scale. And to the extent that there was a redistribution of resources, this was not from the richest to the poorest, which is the redistribution we have in mind. It was from the less powerful to the more powerful within a more violent society, let's say. And the reason for this is that this desire for more, and therefore I sort of disagree with an initial premise, is that this desire for more, I would argue, and I argue in the book at length, something I can't do now, is not something that is due to capitalism, although some of advertisement and so on might have a role, but they are not the secret as to why people want more, which doesn't necessarily mean more stuff. So don't think of like having 15 cars rather than one. It is more as in an improvement with respect to your conditions. And this improvement can be defined in multiple ways, including a better relationship with nature. And we will see that in a second. And this desire for more, again, I argue, is linked to the way we have progressed as humanity, which is seeing the environment around us and not taking it for the environment as in seeing the conditions that we were living in and then using the only thing we're good at, which is developing new ideas and coming up with new ideas, new ways of doing things, technology and innovation together. So we're not particularly good as an individual, but we're exceptionally good as groups with respect to other animals, let's say, on the planet. We come together, we develop new ideas, and we use these ideas, innovation, technology, to get more of what we want more of, which, as I said, can be defined in a multiplicity of ways. And this is sort of a desire of self-determination, so to define our own destiny, or as much as possible, and to use what we're good at, and so technology and innovation to shape our destiny as a species. Maybe just one word to connect or to show, to make this point even stronger given the setting we're in. I would argue that, let's say, agriculture itself belongs to this type of reading. And so the very trade, the very activity that we now consider as in relationship with nature is, in a way, was born by the desire of having more of what we wanted more of, in this case food, and using what we had at the time to get more of it. Initially, and again, it is not, what you're doing is effectively you're bending some rules of the natural environment to your own benefit. And in a way, the way it started, or the way agriculture started early on, was through slash and burn. So you didn't have fertilizers, you had basically zero knowledge or extremely limited knowledge of agricultural patterns. So what you would do is you would slash, burn, and then cultivate on a land until it was effectively barren, and then you would move on. This is extremely inefficient, let's say, but that's a bit how it started. Of course, you were not planting everything. You were planting what you wanted more of. In a way, this was affecting, in today's lingo, we would say you were affecting biodiversity, because you're planting the stuff you cared about. And of course, you weren't just planting, and even if you decided you wanted more corn, it's not like you just planted corn and let it be, but you were trying to hybridize. And all of this is not an invention of, modernity, I don't know, GMO techniques or whatnot. This is how agriculture has progressed throughout history. And just as a show, modern corn, or let's say corn, did not look the way corn looks right now. And it has, through a hybridization, people were looking for characteristics that they wanted more of, typically size, typically the ease with which you could collect it, and so on and so forth. And this is, my mother happens to work to be a plant biologist, so she actually sent me an actual picture of corn in its original form, let's say, and what modern corn looks like. Just one word again, given the setting we're in, and then I proceed to a close. One word on agriculture, let's say the concept of growth and climate change that is upon us or ahead of us. And the point I wanted to make there is that growth remains an important element also in agriculture, also in food production. And the reason why I say this is for a multiplicity of reasons. The first is that as climate change, we're already experiencing some of the effects of climate change. And as that happens, we were talking with someone before about the droughts that the south of Spain is already experiencing. That kind of patterns of extreme weather events, whether it's droughts or whether it's floods, affect agricultural yields. Because we will see some climate change. We're trying to avoid the worst of the worst, let's say. But some degree of it is going to happen, is already happening. And as that happens, if we don't intervene, if you don't push, let's say, innovative solutions to try and maintain yields high, the baseline ahead of us is one in which yields and therefore food production are shrinking. Just because of, let's say, how the weather is changing, and that's what the chart on the right shows. It comes from a recent paper on Nature, Climate Change, and it effectively argues that there has, since the 1960s, there has already been a huge drop in yields, or let's say the changing climate has already affected yields dramatically, and the reason why the overall production has not shrunk is that in parallel there was a push to innovate and to improve on agriculture and agricultural techniques, and that is sort of where the clash has happened. And up until now, let's say, innovation, also in the field of agriculture, has managed to retain overall output. The second point is that, of course, climate is not the only dimension. We care about several things right now, including biodiversity. One way in which we will try to improve our relationship with nature is we're trying to shrink, let's say, our direct impact on the environment, which means we need to return large swathes of land to nature, whether these are forests, whether they're in agriculture. We will need yields to go up. How this happens, I leave to you. You are the experts of this field. So whether it is with innovation in the way you build the supply chains, whether it is innovation in using new techniques, whether it is hydroponics, whether it is indoor farming, I don't know, and to a certain extent I don't care, in the sense that I'm interested in the overall process of how innovation and growth interconnect, and I leave the details of how to do the hard part to the professionals. Just one word on this nexus that I started with growth and nature. In light of what I was also saying, what I try to conclude here is to say that growth did not start with the Industrial Revolution. Fast growth started with the Industrial Revolution, but individual civilizations at different points in time experienced growth. It's just they didn't call it that way. Of course, in ancient Egypt, the pharaohs weren't looking for GDP growth and the latest indicators, but they would have seen elements of prosperity, which you could have seen in abundance of food, population growth, technological advancement that was allowing you to do things that others were not being capable of doing, and things like that, which are in a way the definition itself in abstract of what economic growth is all about. The overarching conclusions, and I promise I am coming to an end, are that in order to avoid a climate disaster, let's say, we will need a huge push on innovation. And what I argue, or I try to argue in the book, is that while capitalism has many flaws, and some of its tendencies, for example, are to concentrate wealth in the hands of some if you don't take corrective measures, it has one advantage, which is that over the past 200 years, it has proved to be a very efficient machinery at doing one thing and one thing only, which is fostering the development and the deployment of new technologies. So if you believe that we need to accelerate or to be fast in terms of developing new green technologies and ways of doing things, what I try to argue is let's leverage the system. It doesn't happen on its own. So again, this is not a Panglossian call for you to sit back, relax, and wait for capitalism to do its magic. It is a call to say if we put the right measures in place, we can try to orient the machinery to our advantage and in the service of our needs, which in this moment are to improve our relationship with nature. I sit in normally, when I'm not on a stage in Segorbe, I normally sit in Brussels, which is a policy city. So people are always thinking about policies and what policy can do and what the European Union can do and the regulations and so on. There is a lot that governments can do in terms of carbon pricing, regulation. We can go into the details if you want after a beer or two. But there's a lot more to that. Mine is not a call for governments to do the green transition. And actually, I don't think that alone governments can do this, but rather that you need businesses, let's say pioneering businesses that are exploring with different models, new ways of doing things to be on board, and you need citizens / consumers to be on board. Citizens in the fact that they define what governments can do themselves. The degree to which citizens are on board with this green transition defines what we can do in terms of policies as governments. And the same people happen to be also consumers, and so in being more responsible consumers, you're helping out businesses lead the way in sustainability. So I'm talking about something that is closer to a whole of nation approach rather than government-led or capitalism-led alone. There's much more in the book, which I'm not going to discuss today. There's a reflection on what I was sort of hinting at before with the donut model. So what is the relationship between growth, well-being, with the system, the political system we live in, so liberal democracy, and so on. The book sounds super abstract the way I've presented it to you. It sounds like I've done this reflections on ancient Egypt and the concept of growth. As a matter of fact, it has some very practical elements, and some chapters are really more case studies. And you can see that because, for example, there's one chapter on Italy, the country I know best, that sort of fell into a steady state. So it wasn't by policy design, but it's a country that for 20 plus years has effectively seen a steady state economy. And what I try to show in the chapter is what happens, what are the negative forces that are unleashed if you enter into a steady state economy, and particularly so if you do that on your own. So if other countries continue on a growth path and you're the only one to be stuck in this negative equilibrium, which leads us to the point of a world that is wider, that is heterogeneous, with many nations, with many priorities. We're coming out of COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, so we've seen that very much in the newspapers over the past few weeks. And there is one chapter that is devoted to really understanding what we can expect on climate change, which is a global problem, but what can we realistically expect from these negotiations at the global level. There's a reflection that goes deeper than what I could do in a few minutes on what innovation is, how it comes about. And then finally, again, a practical chapter that goes into the detail of a blueprint as to what governments, businesses, and consumers can do within this model I have in mind. I'll stop at that. Thank you very much for your attention.